Well, good morning and welcome to our live video here at Concordia Technology Solutions. My name is Peter Frank. I'm the Senior Manager of Marketing Technology here at CTS, and I am excited to join you once again. It's been several weeks. We've had a number of different projects going on that have interrupted our workflow, but I'm happy to be back this week and be joined by our guest who is a frequent contributor to our blog and also our live videos. Before I introduce him, though, let me ask you a question about work in the church. Do you ever find that you are working on a project a bit too long or putting too much time into it? It gets to the point that it's never quite perfect and it never even launches, so to speak. It never even gets implemented. Sometimes that can be referred to as like analysis paralysis or a failure to launch. There's a number of different ways that this shows up. I know I experienced that in several different areas of life before coming here to CTS and even sometimes after being here. But once I came here, I've learned about a new methodology, or fairly new, at least new to me, called the Agile methodology. And it's a fascinating subject that has implications particularly within software development. That's where it started. But it goes far beyond that, and we utilize it in a variety of ways here at CTS now. But we're going to talk about how to utilize that methodology in the church. So I am joined by Reverend Bill Johnson. Bill is the Director of Educational Technology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Bill, how are you today?
Hey, doing pretty good, Peter. And I got to say, just got to jump in here. I'm watching on my other screen, and I just saw my mom join the stream. So I got to say hi, Mom.
That's fantastic. Well, wonderful. Cool. I'm glad she joined us. Raises the stakes a little bit on you to be professional today. Not that that's ever a problem.
Yeah, no pressure, right?
That's right. Well, Bill, it's been a little while since we spoke and maybe a little while since our audience has heard from you. Can you tell us a little bit about your role there at the other CTS, probably the original CTS or CTS FW as you guys prefer to go by?
There we go. That simplifies things a little bit. Yeah, I'm the Director of Educational Technology, and honestly, we're a really small shop at this point. There's 5 or 6 of us who work in the technology area, so that means that I'm working with everything from helping out with the website to helping implement a lot of our programming processes, that kind of thing, to our learning management server, helping with technology in the classroom and some of the pedagogical questions that go with that. So it's a job that's always keeping me doing new things and always keeping life interesting. So it's a great place to be.
Well, that's awesome. And you bring just a really interesting background of having that theological training, but just a deep fascination and interest in technology, and of course, how to apply it in a very practical way. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you about this subject today. Like I mentioned, Agile was something that I had never heard of before getting involved with the software here at CTS. But the problems that it tries to solve are definitely familiar to me and I'm sure to many others. Can you start off by talking about what these problems were before the Agile methodology kind of came into existence or was defined?
Sure. Well, and typically in the past when you started sort of a software project, you would go through your phases, your analysis, your design, implementation, etc. And a lot of time was tied up in that analysis phase. It was figuring out what are the user requirements? What does this product need to do? What is the end goal of it? What is the feature set? You'd have your use case scenarios, all of those sorts of things that happen, and they're all important and they're all good. But what could happen so very easily is that you would take and you would spend months or even years gathering your requirements and doing your analysis. You would program a solution, get your design done, implement it, send it off for evaluation for initial testing, and discover that one of your pre-assumptions in your analysis phase was completely wrong, or that something had changed in between points A and B during that time you spent gathering information, with the result that you had now created this incredible software project for a problem that didn't exist. And so there was no market for it. There was no way to sell it. It ended up costing a lot of companies a lot of money to do it that way. And so something was needed. You needed to do it a little bit different to enable to get feedback just a little bit earlier in that cycle.
Well, before we go into the details of Agile, can you explain how these problems kind of manifest themselves in similar ways within the church setting? Because obviously our audience is our church workers, not software developers. But I think there's a
Right.
lot of similarities.
Oh, absolutely. And this was a fun one just writing because I was thinking through and just how often these two things interact. It's not something I would have ordinarily thought of, honestly, but playing with it a little bit, I was brought to mind in my own experience of a congregation that'll remain nameless that I worked with where they actually owned an apartment building next door to the church property, and they used the income from that to help support and fund the church. And it was a great arrangement for everybody. The residents got a great landlord with a lot of understanding, a lot of graces needed, that kind of thing. But there was this concern on the part of the residents that they wanted new washers and dryers put in because the old ones were getting dated. And so, came in, found out about this, sat through a few council meetings. Finally, about the third or fourth council meeting talking about this, I discovered that this had been on the agenda for 5 years.
Oh my
That it had
goodness.
been through multiple different heads of the board of trustees, that it had been through person after person after person, and it had been analyzed and looked at and reviewed. And every time it got to the point where we could actually act and make a decision, either the personnel changed or a new model was out or the requirements changed in some way. And so there was this paralysis where the church couldn't pull the trigger on this thing to make it happen. And I think that happens fairly often in the church. We want to do something, but we've got limited resources. We want to be responsible with them. And so we overanalyze to the point that we never act.
I think that often comes with the explanation of good stewardship, which, like you said, is a very good thing, but it can easily lead to these indecisions and extending that process. So describe to us at a high level, and then we'll get into more details, but at a high level, what is the Agile methodology?
Sure. The idea behind Agile is that you want to get a working prototype up and running as fast as possible. So if you're trying to program a piece of scheduling software, and I'm just kind of going to make this up as we go, then you're going to get a scheduling program up and running as quickly as you can. You're going to have a start time, you're going to have an end time, you're going to make sure that it triggers the right things when it happens, and then you're going to take that prototype that may not look pretty, the interface might be hideous, if I've designed it I know it's going to be, and you get it in the hands of your testers, and ideally even a handful of your customers right away. And so they can try it and say, okay, yeah, this works, but no, you don't understand how we do things with this over here. And you can, from the very, very beginning, start getting that feedback cycle going, start to see what changes need to be made right at the outset. And that's such a huge benefit for getting something up and running quickly.
That's excellent. And it's we talk about how it can be applied in the church and not just in software development. It can be applied in almost any area. We're using that on our marketing team, and it's kind of a modified version of Agile. There's a very structured way of doing Agile that if you ask the biggest proponents of that, that's what they'll tell you. I was talking with an agency that we're working with on a big project, and one of the gentlemen asked me if we're using Agile. I was like, yeah, it's a modified, and he said, I think everybody uses a modified version of Agile. So if
the philosophy kind of lends itself to tweaking on the fly. So
well,
it makes
exactly,
sense.
yeah. It's hard to be agile and also really structured too. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of different ways to apply it, and we're going to talk about 5 ways today. So the first way is to think in processes, not in goals. Can you talk about that? You talk about that quite a bit in our blog post, and we'll share the link for that later on. But can you explain that idea of thinking in processes, not goals?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, but it's such a fundamental change, and it's important not just in Agile methodology, but I think it's really a life skill on a lot of levels. So often, I think today we're conditioned to this idea that you try something and the outcome is either success or failure. You start a new program and either it's going to succeed or it's going to fail. And that sort of thinking kind of stops at that point. All right, if you succeed, awesome, then that was good. And if you fail, of course, that's bad. And maybe there's some lessons you can pull out of that. But it puts all of the pressure on this single moment, single instance thing, rather than starting to look at the entire process long term. The reality is that whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, failure is a part of the process of success. Unless you're that person who every time you try something, like first time it succeeds, in which case I want you to write my code for me. You know, failure is a part of that. You're going to write something, you're going to try something, you're going to do something, and it's not going to work right, or it's going to sort of work right, or it's going to work, but it could be a lot better. And that's okay. That's a part of this process-oriented thinking, viewing the entire process from beginning all the way to end, and I'm not even sure if you can define an end to it, where you're trying something, analyzing, learning, improving, and rather than approaching projects as point instances that are either going to succeed or fail, instead then we're tackling that as a part of the process of growing this thing into something bigger.
You know, as adults, and I know you're a father as well, we share that with our kids. Like, it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to learn from this. But I think we often forget that as adults, that it is okay to make mistakes. It is okay to fail. It's so simple for us to tell our kids, like, you're learning. It's a lot harder when it's when you're expecting to be there already. We'll talk about failure a little bit more, but let's go back to goals for just a quick second. Do goals still have a place in the church?
Oh, absolutely. And we were talking a little bit before we went on air here. This isn't about just, randomly doing things and seeing what happens. This is a structured thing where we've got an idea in mind. We know we're in a community of 20-somethings who are starting to get married and beginning to have families. Okay, so we want to create programs and supports and structures that will reach out to them and will make them feel more at home, or that they'll be at least able to take advantage of so that we can engage our community. Awesome, that's a goal. Now, there's not one magic bullet that's going to do that, and quite frankly, it's another discussion for another day, but I'm not sure programs are really the answer to that age group anyway. But the point is that, yeah, you're going to pick something and you're going to focus on it, and we're working towards something, but that's okay. It's the question of, how are we getting there? How are we taking a look at the journey, as well as what are the adjustments we make that drive us closer to that goal?
That's excellent. Yeah. At my church right now, goals weren't really a thing in the past, at least not defined goals. And so as you're talking, I'm thinking about our goal process almost being more of a process than goals. It's starting off trying goals and getting everybody acclimated to that idea of pointing in a direction. But like you said, there's so many different ways to get to that, and it's getting started. So let's talk about failure, especially failure in the church. But I'm going to get a little theological here. Isn't failure a sin? Like, isn't doing wrong a sin? Bring on your pastor's collar for a little while here.
All right, yeah, I'll go throw that on real quick. But, I don't know if we've ever hit, software methodology and theology in the same podcast before. So, failure, no, absolutely not. There are certainly some sins that represent failure. In fact, I think all sin represents failure to live up to God's standard of perfection, for which we have, of course, redemption in Christ, and don't ever want to, separate those two things. But no, failure, if the athlete who takes the slap shot on net, it's hockey season for me, so that's where my brain is, misses the net and this is a sin, well, that... A, where's that in Scripture? First of all, I'd want to wrestle with that. But B, that would mean we could never try anything out of that paralysis for fear of failure, right? And that's not the life God wants us to lead. It's not the God that we find revealed in Scripture. Instead, there are things we're going to try that aren't going to work. There are things that we do every day that are just mistakes, that aren't necessarily, rising to that level of sin, but where we're getting it wrong. We trip and fall. We step in the wrong spot and our footing gives way. Whatever it is, there's plenty of things that happen in life that aren't the way they're supposed to be. And I suppose if we want to go really, really abstract with that, I can say this is a result of the broken nature of our world and the fall into sin and the abstract. But in terms of the practical consequence of what you're asking, no, don't be afraid to fail.
So we talk about this idea of failing early. How do we go about failing early in the church without harming the church? Knowing it's not a sin to fail, but knowing there's consequences to failure.
There are, and we want to be wise stewards of the resources we have. So before we, launch into a project, we want to at least have a little bit of that analysis, not 5 years worth, but a little bit to know that, okay, so the families around us, if they're all 20-somethings, then maybe the seniors stay out isn't the right approach to take. We want to think about it and count the cost a little bit. But at the same time, at a certain point, you just need to try something and see what happens. It's the only way to get the information. You try it, see what happens, you evaluate it, and I know we're going to get into a little bit more of that, but we can't be afraid to try. So often I think churches are so worried that they've got this one shot to get it right, that, I'm going to continue that analogy. If we're trying to reach out to these young families, then if we start a Mother's Day out or a daycare program or whatever, and we don't get it perfect the first time, then that's our one shot, and they're never coming back, and we're never going to be able to do this. When in reality, that same congregation would be better served by finding a lighter weight piece, something that's not as resource intensive as a full-on Mother's Day Out program that's meeting every week and requires volunteer infrastructure and all of that. Maybe it's a one-time event. Maybe it's something that we just go ahead and do one time, publicize it, test it, see how it went, see what worked, see what didn't, and use that to inform things. And if this thing is successful and it grows into that bigger thing, then along the way we build the infrastructure that's going to support that bigger thing.
That's excellent. Well, let's talk about another area of failure. So that's failing early. So getting out there, not letting the analysis slow us down. What about failing often? Shouldn't we slow down our failure after we get better at things? And I know that might seem like the natural thing, but Agile is all about failing often, and not just at the beginning, but throughout the process. Can you explain that kind of, complicated thought process?
Yeah, well, the idea is that you're never really just content with where things are at. You're not going to reach that point where this is the one perfect thing our church is doing that is meeting the needs of everybody in our community, because everybody in your community is different. There's always that space to look for that next level and to keep stepping forward, stepping into that. And as long as you're looking for that, you're also then going to be trying things, and some of those things are going to succeed, but the reality is that many, if not most, aren't going to, and that's okay too. So when we talk about failing often, what we're really saying is we're not going to stop developing this thing. We're not going to not stop expanding it. We're going to continue to expand. We're going to continue to drive forward with new ideas, new features, new pieces to drive it, so that we can continue to make what's good even better.
Can you put that in a little bit more practical terms within the church? I know you shared a couple of examples in the blog post. Maybe recap a few of those about failing often.
Oh gosh, you're going to make me remember what I wrote now. I think I've slept 3 times since then, right?
Well, just a few practical examples of what that means, where it's later in the process and we're still attempting to fail, and so to speak, putting ourselves out there to the point of failing.
Well, stepping away from the blog post for a minute, because I think I've actually used a lot of the examples that I worked in there. But so we're developing this 20-something ministry. We're reaching out into a community with young children, and we've tried the Christmas shopping babysitting event. We tried a lot of these smaller things that lead up to something bigger. Well, then once we've got a full-fledged outreach going, where we've got a Mother's Day Out program or whatever that ends up looking like in our circumstance, the question is, okay, what's the next thing with that? If we're just babysitting the kids, is there room here that maybe while the kids are hanging out with us, we start to incorporate some spiritual formation? We start to incorporate some teaching and catechesis for these kids? Is there room in our community that we've got some families that maybe need a little bit more support in getting here or in finding out how to take advantage of these things? We're always looking for that next level of how can we better serve our community. What are the needs that we're meeting right now, but what is this larger area of unmet need that we can step into and begin to sort of dip our toe into and figure out what it looks like to expand into that as well?
It's almost like the complete opposite of that phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's saying, what's the next step? How do we take it even farther? Even if we break it by doing that, how do you
Oh
keep
yeah,
pushing forward?
yeah. It's that engineering phrase. If it ain't broke, take her with it till it is.
There you go. Well, let's talk about feedback. Feedback is, a phrase that we use in everyday language. Here at CTS, it has a little bit more meaning behind it. We used to do a process where everything's were tickets, and we still have tickets, but every request for a new feature in the software became a ticket that we would track and add other case numbers to it. And what we've switched to is this idea of feedback being everything anybody says about our software, good, bad, or otherwise. We put it into our feedback tool. Can you talk about feedback within the Agile method or methodology and how that really fits into it?
Yeah, well, part of failing often is learning from failing often. If you're not learning from it, then you're wasting time, you're wasting resources, and good stewardship's out the window. And so we want to be sure that we're listening. We want to be sure that when we send this over to our test group, to our evaluators, or even into our community, that we're hearing what they're saying and we're really hearing it. I know so often for me as a web developer, when I'm wearing that hat, one of the things I want to do is, I'll get a new feature working or a new page layout, and I'll go and show our PR director, and she looks at it and says, that's confusing, and I have no idea how this is supposed to work. Well, I'm invested in this thing at this point. I've spent, minutes or maybe hours writing this, and I want her to like it because I've got my thought process behind it. And I can spend 20 minutes sitting with her explaining why it shouldn't be confusing to her. And it won't change the reality that it was confusing to her, that she looked at it and initially didn't get it. So I can either waste that 20 minutes of both of our lives trying to argue why it should be different or why she should feel different or think different about it, or I can accept that what she said, her feedback, is fact. It's true. It's something that she initially experienced. And so I can take that back, look at my code and figure out where is, the confusion happening. What's causing this? Is it just that she doesn't get websites? Probably not. She's pretty savvy. Or is it that there's something else going on with the interface, the color choice, whatever it is, but we can start to use that feedback then in a formative way to begin to make the product better. And the same's true in the church. When somebody comes and says, I had it the other week. We had a closing song in worship, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Yeah, so who picked that one?" And it turns out it was me. And said, I really don't like it. And I said, okay, well, why is that? And started to explore, okay, what is it about? And I think that came down to it was just louder than some of the other stuff we've done. But nonetheless, learning from that and starting to get a feel for what are the real concerns, and keeping in mind that sometimes the concern that's vocalized is not necessarily the concern that's really the problem. A lot of times this is actually about that, and we have to listen with those ears as well.
It's tough to take the opinion idea out of it, because what you're saying is, if going back to your example of the website, if it is confusing, explaining it doesn't mean that it was any less confusing to begin with. We often share this quote from a former president here at CPH. He used to work at Nestle Purina, also in town here, and he had the phrase, if the dogs don't eat it, it's not dog food. And that's the reality, is that if it's not immediately meeting the needs that it was designed to meet, then it's not meeting the needs. It doesn't matter if it should meet the needs or not. It's just not. And I think that's easy to come up with examples in the church where if people aren't actively coming to an event or are not actively engaged, if it's not working, it's not working. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't have worked, it just means that it's not. And that's where feedback, like taking it back a step and saying, it is what it is. It informs the process, really takes that personal opinion, even though it's still in there, takes the sting out of it and just says, it is what it is. We're running short on time, so I'm going to jump to our number 5 thing here, which is focus on one or two things to learn. It's not about changing changing everything entirely. Can you talk about this? Why is it so important to start small with the Agile methodology?
Yeah, well, it start small and stay focused. Both of those things, because first of all, a lot of our congregations are Lutheran, and we don't handle change well. Just don't. But it is the kind of thing where you want to make small incremental changes that add up then to transformational change over time. We don't want to try to leap right into transformational, because then we run the risk of not having laid the foundation we need to go forward. So, we want to start by making small changes, experiment with them a little bit, but we also want to make sure that we're making these changes with two things in mind. One, that we're working towards a goal. All the way back to the beginning here, this is not just random haphazard change. This is change with a purpose in mind that we've set out, and we're still working towards it. If we're not anymore, fine, let's own that, and we'll move on to something else. But as long as we're still working towards that goal, then we need to ensure that our changes are moving us in the right direction towards it. Second, and this is more of a problem in church work, I think, than software development, is you want to be aware of change fatigue. That at a certain point, people need to have a rhythm and to have something settled. And so, you want to settle things down and make sure that you're not pushing your folks too hard, too far on that. There's a certain amount of stress that comes with it. I'm going to cheat on my current pastor a little bit and talk about something he did, where we had a series of about 6 weeks where we were really struggling with, in the space we're in, what's the best way to do communion. And he decided to do 6 weeks of experiments with a different way each week. Yeah. And needless to say, there was a little feedback that was brought to the table on that one. But it turned out to be some great data, and what we settled on has actually worked for us for years now. And overall, the process outcome was good. But there were a lot of folks who got real uncomfortable about week 4 or 5 of that process. And so we do want to be mindful of that we are working with real living flesh and blood people. And we want to take their thoughts and feelings and stress levels into concern, into consideration, there's the word, when we're thinking about that.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for joining me today and going through that. It's always fascinating to hear your thoughts on things, and I really appreciate you writing the post for us. So I encourage our audience to go to our blog at concordiatechnology.org and read Bill's post. You're welcome to add comments to the post or to this live video if you have any questions or ideas on how to implement the Agile methodology in your congregation. We'd love to hear from you. Please join us next week. We'll be talking about email marketing, marketing within the church. That's a scary thought. And I'll be joined by Laura Horn, who will go through that process with us. So I invite you to tune back next Thursday, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much. Have a great day.